Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tycos. Today we're going to talk a bit more about Japan. Long before the 2008 U.S. financial crisis, Japan faced a severe real estate debt crisis of its own. The trajectory of Japan's crisis in the 1990s mirrors what we experienced after 2008 and what China is currently dealing with in their own real estate crisis. We find Japan as a useful harbinger of debt trends, population growth trends, and even societal trends, and can help us get a sense of what might happen next in China. Last week, we looked at Japan's public debt, and we also looked quickly at their massive run-up in private sector debt that peaked with the calamity of the 1990s. Here we see that ugly trend as Japan overbuilt egregiously. The steep slope of this line is the almost surefire sign of overlending and overbuilding, and Japan's crisis was massive. Now let's add the U.S. from 1998 to 2008, lining up the year 1993 in Japan with 2008 in the U.S., and you can see the same steep slope of the line showing that we had massive overlending and overbuilding in the years leading up to 2008. Both lines are steep, indicating pending calamity, though we see that the U.S. peak is actually quite a bit lower. We see this same slope of line in almost every such calamity we study, whether the U.S. in 1873, the U.S. in 1929, Spain in 2009, and any number of other crises. But let's say what happened after these two respective crises. However egregious the sins of the U.S. lending industry were, Japan's were worse. And so it's no surprise that the decline from that peak was steeper and longer in Japan. In Japan, private lending growth didn't start again until 2019, fully 26 years later. In the U.S., where the sins were less, lending growth started again in 2016, only 8 years later. Make no mistake, GDP growth is largely a function of private sector debt growth. If private sector loans aren't growing in ratio to GDP, it's hard for an overall economy to grow. Japan's GDP growth flatlined for 20 years because the private sector was still deleveraging. And U.S. GDP rebounded in just a few years, in part because private debt to GDP started to grow again. Now, it may seem obvious to you, but in both Japan and the U.S., the government does not control how much lending the private sector does. So after their respective crises, U.S. lenders and Japanese lenders retrenched and moderated their lending until the overcapacity was sufficiently absorbed and the balance sheets were sufficiently repaired. Only then did they begin to accelerate lending again. It just took a lot longer in Japan because they had overlent so much more. It is only very recently that Japan's lending industry has truly begun to grow loans again. So now let's look at China. Let's start by laying recent trends in China on top of these two, lining up 2020 in China with 1993 in Japan and 2008 in the U.S. When we do that, you can see that China's lending profligacy has been every bit as egregious as Japan's was in 1993 and much worse than the U.S.'s. The consequences of that are beginning to emerge. China's lenders have gone far beyond the dictates of prudence, and China has over 100 million empty dwellings to show for it, and is beginning to see failures like Evergrande mount up. The two main things that China's overlending has gone toward in the past few years have been to build houses that never get lived in and to produce exports that are sold well below cost, the so-called dumping they are now being accused of. And importantly, the way GDP is measured, China gets to record GDP growth even if the houses are never sold and even if there are never profits on those exports. So what will happen now in China? Will we now see China's real estate lenders and businesses deleverage as they did in Japan and the US? Actually, we don't think so, at least over the near term. And this is where we get into the difference between the communist command economy in China and the market economies of the US and Japan. China can tell its banks to keep lending. In the late 90s, with Japan's crisis, Daiichi Kongo and Japan's other large lenders pulled back significantly. In 2009, with the US crisis, JP Morgan, Citibank, and others pulled back significantly, and US mortgage lenders in particular either went out of business or pulled back. But in China, the lenders are simply going to do whatever the government tells them to do, knowing full well that that government can prop them up as needed. The reason is that if China's lenders significantly slow down or stop lending, the country will see a calamitous slowdown in its GDP growth, all the way down to zero or worse. And with it, all the job loss and other pain that implies. China keeps trying to slow down its lending, but when it sees the resulting slowdown in GDP, it always balks and reverses course. After restraining its lenders last year, China saw the resulting deceleration of GDP, and so now is flogging its lenders to increase their loans once again. And if its banks keep lending, GDP will continue to grow and jobs will remain in place. But that lending will continue to result in the same old things, which is more empty buildings and even more, in essence, forced exports priced well below cost. Remember, GDP growth is largely a function of loan growth, even if that loan growth brings empty buildings and even more export dumping. To maintain social stability, China more or less has to pursue this course for as long as it can. But with so many empty buildings, China's real estate growth can't go on indefinitely. It's really hard to carry empty buildings even if you're a Chinese real estate firm. And as much as China continues to ramp up its dumping of below-cost exports, that will be gradually impeded as the rest of the world wises up and slaps on more and higher tariffs, as we're already seeing in the US and Europe. So as much as China will resist this, we expect China's lending to moderate over the next few years, and with that, we expect growth to continue to decline in that period from the stellar 15% per year of the early 2000s to something in the low single digits over the next few years. China has no great choices at this point. That's all for this week. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and join us next week as we discuss interest rates. Thanks.